Good day, everyone. What I'm going to share to you today is about modern growth and developing countries. We usually think that if one member of a family is rich, then the whole family would also be enjoying riches. In the same manner, if one family in a clan is rich, then the whole clan would be enjoying wealth. We think that somehow the basic goodness of man will always good him to share his bounties with his gains. But of course, we also know that this is the ideal situation. Not everyone in a rich clan is rich. Some rich clans have what is sometimes called the poorer relations. In the same manner, in the family of nations, there are rich members as well as poor members. For some reasons, the riches of the former do not rub on the latter. What are these reasons? You must have noted that this is the question raised in the previous discussions. A partial answer was attempted. We will attempt to answer this question more fully. Our answers will be based on what we already know about the growth of developed countries. We will expand this discussion by finding out what we can learn from the growth experience of these countries. Later, we shall discuss the price a developed country has to pay for academic economic growth. We have learned that the growth experience of the developed nation does not spread to the developing nations. Even granting that this experience is now spreading to the developing nations, the spread is too slow to mean much. There are two reasons behind the limited spread of growth. The first one is related to the internal conditions of most developing nations, and the second one pertains to the nature of relationship between developed and developing nations. We have learned that it takes more than resources and know-how to make an economy grow. There is also a need for a social and political structures that will support and encourage rapid economic change. And these structures are the internal conditions needed for economic growth. As regards to political structure, a developing nation has to be an independent state and not a colony. It has to have an efficient government ruled by persons who will serve the nation's welfare and not their own selfish interest. The leaders must also make policies that will encourage and not hinder economic growth. As regard to social structure, the value system and the relationship between people must encourage economic growth, and this relationship and value system must be characterized by the following. It must have a confidence in the ability of an individual to solve his own problems, a high respect for individual achievements, impersonality in the management of social affairs, the use of legal rules to enforce social responsibility. And the opposite of these values are a reliance upon primary groups, especially kinship groups, in the solution of problems, respect for social status rather than individual achievement or merit, stress on interest of primary groups as against the interest of the national community, and use of personal, traditional rules to enforce social responsibility. How do the above values inhibit economic growth? When people emphasize as established pattern of economic life, family obligation and traditional religious beliefs, they may simply adopt the attitude of accepting what happens to exist rather than attempting to change it. They would have an attitude of resignation rather than innovation. Even though they may have the abilities, they would lack the motivation to introduce change. The social and political structure of the society is then difficult to change. In some cases, groups such as landlords who benefited from the old structure exert their power to maintain the old system. The second explanation for the limited spread of growth concern the economic and political policies of the developed countries concerning developing ones. As we learned in our previous discussion, the rich nation often controls the conditions of each relationship with a poor nation. The poor nation is usually weak, economically and politically, to protest. So, it cannot refuse the social values, institutions, and technology, which the rich nations transfers to it. It keeps silent, though it may know that these transfers may not solve its problems, but even worsen them. The transfer of these things may slow down or even be a barrier to the poor nation's growth because of three reasons. The first, of course, such wholesale transfer strengthen the dependence of poor nations on the rich ones. Second, the objects transfers may not suit the conditions in the developing nations, as we have learned in the previous discussion. They may not even be appropriate to be developed goals, more employment of a developing nations. And third, such transfers, even if beneficial to the developing nation, may not continue for long, maybe due to the increasing scarcity of resources. Rich nations may in the future stop supporting such transfers. If the operation of the objects or institutions transferred cannot be supported by the economy of the poor nation, then the poor nation will suffer once the support of the rich nation stops. The social structure. Confidence in the ability of an individual to solve this problem. In high respect for individual achievement, as I mentioned, impersonality in the management social affairs, use of legal rules to enforce social responsibility. So, why few lessons can be learned? From historical growth experience, no, the tricks of growth are not all that difficult. So, says by W. Rostow, who mentioned earlier as one of those who formulated the linear stages theory of growth. Planners failed to see that there are significant difference between condition in the developing nation in those in developed ones when they were stopping or starting to develop. These differences concern, of course, is the available physical and human resources, per capita income, and GNP levels. In relation to other countries, of course, climate differences, population size, distribution, and growth, rates and inequality of international migration, benefits derived from international trade, basic capabilities in science, technology, and development skills, stability and flexibility of political institution. Now, for physical resources, when they began their economic growth, developed nations were rich in natural resources. The U.S., for instance, is known to have the highest reserves of coal, copper, lead, molybdenum, natural gas, silver, and zinc. With the exemption of oil-rich nations, most developing nations today suffer in comparison with these nations. Many Asian countries with this not rich in natural resources. To worsen this condition, much of the resources are used as raw materials for the industries of rich nations. Thus, little is left to the poor nations when they start on their own industrialization. Some nations of Latin America and Africa are rich in natural resources, but this cannot be developed without heavy investment of capital. And this capital is not easy to secure since loaning institutions are controlled by rich nations who may also be interested in developing the untapped resources for their own purposes. Next, of course, is the human resources. The people in today's developing nations are less educated, less experienced, and less skilled than the people who developed nations during the early years of their growth. There is particularly a shortage in managerial and technical skills, and we may note, however, that some developing nations report high literacy rates, the proportion of people who can read or write. These rates may be as high as 90%, but these rates are often misleading because the definition of literacy is not adequate. A person is considered literate once he is able to read and write. To be literate, a person should be functionally literate. That is, he should be able to read with understanding and write with understanding. Per capita income and GNP. The citizens of today's developing nation are less fit and less healthy than the citizens of developed nations during their early growth years. We found that one-third of the population in developing areas are below the poverty line. That is, they do not earn enough to feed, clothe, and house themselves decently. How can saving and investment be derived from poor populations? These per capita differences add up to the national differences between two cases. Today's poor countries are attempting to speed up their development from a lower economic level than which the rich countries had at the time of their rapid rates of development. Thus, in their economic relationship with other countries, the poor nations are considered inferior and therefore weak. The early cases, however, occupied a superior position compared to other countries when they started on the industrialization process. The climate differences. As we recall the nations which we classified as developing nations, we need to take note that each of these is in the tropical zone. On the other hand, all the developed nations lie in the temperature zone or temperate zone. So the argument goes, development is all a matter of climate. Of course, this is a simplistic view of development because climate is an important factor, but it is not an all-important factor of growth. It is only one of the many factors in the growth process. The role that climate plays in development is related to the special difficulties caused directly or indirectly by a certain heat and recurring typhoons and floods. The extremes of heat and humidity in most poor countries decrease soil fertility and easily spoil or wear down many natural goods. Tropical heat also makes workers less able to engage in strenuous work. In general, tropical heat causes discomfort which reduces workers' productivity and efficiency. Population size distribution and growth. Another essential difference is in the serious population pressure faced by today's developing nation. Rates of population increase in these areas are higher than those in the early cases of development. In the latter, the rate of population growth never went higher than 2% per year. But in poor nations, today populations are growing at yearly rates of more than 2.5% per year. Another difference in this aspect is that in the early cases, population growth was somehow encouraged by the high rate of development. In the present cases, growth of the population is simply due to the introduction of public health measures that lower death rates. And also, with the fast increase of the population, there is an urgent need to attain increase in production that will exceed increase in population. This need is more urgent in today's developing nation than it ever was in the early cases. International migration. Migration is the process by which a person leaves one place to settle in another. Such persons are called immigrants. During the early growth years of presently rich nations, international migration was widespread and large in scale. People migrated to other countries to look for better jobs. Such movements of people often occurred when there was famine and when there was a shortage of available jobs. Unskilled workers, especially rural ones, tend to be pushed toward the nation of North America, Australia, and New Zealand. At the time, this nation had small populations and so were more than willing to accept immigrants. A study suggests that the United States benefited much from immigration. It said that the contribution of European labor to the American economy are between 1847 and 1855, and 1.2 million Irish and 919,000 Germans between 1880 and 1885, 418,000 Scandinavians, and 1.4 million Germans in between 1898 and 1907, 1.7 million Italians. In more recent times, international migration occurred mostly within Europe than outside it. In some of today's poor countries, similar migration are taking place. Thousands of unskilled laborers Upper Volta find temporary work in neighboring Ivory Coast. Botswanans find work in South Africa. Tunisians, Moroccans, and Algerians in Europe. Mexicans in the US, and Filipinos in Middle East countries, particularly Saudi Arabia. But these countries may be exemption rather than the rule. Today, large immigration from poor nations are limited by the following strict immigration laws in developed countries, little knowledge about economic opportunities, and the exploitative practices of corrupt foreign recruitment agencies. But perhaps a more important difference between previous migration and present-day ones is that a large percentage of those people who move from poor to richer lands are highly educated and skilled. And these are the very people that a developing nation needs. Thus, this phenomenon has been called brain drain. It is estimated that so far about 400,000 high-level professional and technical workers have left poor nations to work either temporarily or permanently in the rich nations of the United States, Canada, and Britain. A push from international trade. Present day, rich nations expanded their economies mainly through international trade. And since there was not much competition from other nations, their export products were often welcome in many markets. Export earnings encouraged the establishment of more manufacturing industry. Along with a stable political system, these earnings also enabled the countries to borrow funds from foreign countries and loaning agencies at low interest rates. Such loans in turn encourage more production. Today, the situation is different. Poor countries cannot be helped by international trade for several reasons. Of course, number one, the export of poor countries earn not compete with those of rich ones in terms of quantity and diversity. Poor countries tend to compete among themselves in increasing their export and in attracting private capital and skilled poor labor. And technological progress in rich nations has decreased the trade opportunities of poor ones. Another thing is rich nations impose barriers to trade such as high taxes, import limitations, sanitary requirements, and special licensing arrangement. And the price of goods exported by poor nations have steadily declined since the First World War. Example of these goods are sugar and copra. Thus, while the early commerce to the growth process benefited from international trade, today's batch no longer does. Scientific and technological research capabilities. Great advances in science and technology took place in today's rich nation during the early years of their growth, and up to now, these nations lead in scientific and technological discoveries. Stable yet flexible political and social institution. In today's developed nation had been independent state a long time before their economies started to grow. On the other hand, most of today's developing nations were once colonies of European powers and only recently attained political independence. So in these countries, political institutions which promote development are not yet firmly established. For instance, many poor countries are still governed by groups that are not interested in growth. Others are ruled by inefficient and corrupt leaders. There are also socio-cultural differences between the beginnings of today's developing nation and the early comers to development. The latter had a social heritage which promoted development, and the former has a social structure and value system that slowed down development. The value system includes a high respect for social status rather than individual achievement, and these political and social conditions are not favorable to development because modernization requires that the people be oriented towards national rather than the group goal, individual merits rather than social status, scientific thought rather than traditional and religious beliefs, and material rewards of work rather than the material rewards of one's inherited wealth. The social benefits and cost of growth. You must be familiar with the monkey-eating eagle. It has an odd eating habit. It eats monkeys, but it also eats other animals like chickens. It is mostly brown all over, has pale blue eyes, and is about 3 feet long. It is the largest eagle in the country, but bigness, it seems, is no guarantee to a long life. This eagle life is threatened that is its kind may disappear or become extinct soon. Why? Because of man's activities. Man's continued use of natural resources like the forests has disturbed the home of the monkey-eating eagle. Without its natural home, this eagle cannot reproduce, it cannot live long. Many other things in natural are lost or have been degraded because of man's economic exploitation of natural resources. Many rivers that used to teem with fishes are now dead. They can no longer support life because the chemicals that industries dump on them have robbed them of their life-giving constant, such as oxygen. But we might argue man needs to exploit his natural resources to support himself. Of course, nature is for man to master and use. So since man cannot stop his use of nature, he should bear the results of what he does to nature. While he profits from nature, he must also suffer the loss of clean rivers, such of his animal friends, clean rivers, clean air, and more. Perhaps you are now recalling too often repeated phrases. There is a price to pay for everything, and you can't have everything. It used to be thought that economic growth was all good, but now a concern for its cost had made many people think twice about the desirability of economic growth. Whether we should desire economic growth or not would depend on how we weigh the benefits and costs of growth. Social benefits. The social benefits of economic growth include a wide variety of inappropriate things. They are inappropriate since they cannot be taken and offered for sale in markets. Economic growth benefits society not because wealth necessarily increases happiness, but because it increases the range of human choice. The social cost. Social cost refers to a wide variety of harmful effects of productive activities. This cost may be tangible, such as destruction of forests, or this cost may be non-tangible, such as a person's loss of dignity. This cost may be borne or felt by one person, a group of persons, or the economy as a whole. The social cost of economic growth may be classified into two groups: the negative effects of the growth on living conditions and the undesirable nature of attitudes and institutions which are needed in economic growth. In effects on living conditions, there are harmful effects of rapid economic growth on living conditions. Among these are urban concentrations, increased use of resources, and environmental decay. These side effects result from some of the characteristics of growth. We have urban concentration. Industries in towns and cities tend to attract people from the countryside. These people troop to the cities in search of better jobs and better living conditions. Among the more important social costs resulting from urban concentrations are poor housing conditions, traffic congestion causing serious inconvenience and losses of time in traveling to and from places of work, shortage of water for individual needs, fire protection and industrial purposes, increased dangers of calamities like fire, and increased public expenditure for social capital like sanitation, police, and fire protections. Increased incidences of violence, thieving, drunkenness, and prostitution. In environmental decay, the concentration of people in one area, the growth of industries, and the use of chemicals for industrial and agricultural purpose has caused the environmental to decay and become poison. A decaying or polluted environment can kill man. Let us cite some of the examples of environmental decay and their effects. Air pollution in the cities have increased the incidence of respiratory diseases such as colds, flu, and tuberculosis. Chemicals thrown as industrial waste into bodies of water have killed plants and animals' life. The air and water pollution destroy real properties such as building. It also destroys natural resources. We have resources depletion. We have noted that 5.6% of the world's population lives in the US, but this small group requires about 40% of the world's primary resources to keep going. Effects on attitude and institutions. Many people think that the changes in the value systems, attitudes in social institutions that go with economic progress do not help improve living conditions. They say that these changes are especially harmful to those people who have been bred in the traditional and spiritual ways of life. Earlier in this discussion, we have discussed some of the social and political changes that need to come about as a result of economic growth. And here we shall dwell on three specific characteristics of the way of life associated with modernization. The economic spirit. In the In the previous discussion, we have noted that in order to achieve rapid growth, there is a need to save and invest. In industry, saving means that it should get the most returns from a given cost. For instance, industry should be able to make the most number of dresses from a given stretch of cloth, the most harvest from a given land area, or the most number of liters from a given saw. This principle in industry has been called the economizing spirit. People who criticize this principle say that it has led to the exploitation of the weak, such as when laborers are paid a little amount for heavy work like carrying loads over their backs or driving long distances. They also say that this spirit had led to the overemphasis on the need to accumulate wealth for its own sake. The impersonal nature of production. Rapid economic growth requires the creation of economies of scale. This means putting up a plants or factories where operations are made on a large-scale basis so as to lower the cost of production. And some of their characteristics are the assembly line of productions, division of labor, and use of machinery. Critics focus on the dehumanizing aspect of the assembly line of production and the division of labor. Some critics also say that the modern methods of production deprive man of some of his freedoms. Balancing the cost and benefits. Economic growth, it seems it is a double-edged sword. It can strike and harm the person wielding it while it can also protect and save the same from harm. Is it possible that this sword may only protect and save a person? In the same manner, is it possible that man can only benefit from growth and not suffer from its cost? The question is difficult to answer, but the following points should help us weigh the arguments for and against growth. Some of the supposed costs of economic growth are not necessarily used by it. The poor living conditions in urban areas are not caused by growth. It is men by themselves and by choices who made the areas fleeting. Forests need to be laid before because of growth. It is possible for forests to remain harsh and productive even with growth. Some of the supposed evils of growth are not evils in themselves. For instance, the economizing spirit, the growth of towns, and the growth of technology are not evils in themselves. They become undesirable only when they are used in excess and when they serve to enslave rather than free man. The rate of economic growth can be too fast for the health of a society. Hence, it is for society to find out at what pace it could benefit best from economic growth. In summary, the growth experience of developed nations did not spread to developing ones because of the two factors. Again, the international or the internal conditions in developing nations and the unbalanced relationship between developing and developed nations. In their bid for economic growth, developing nations cannot simply use present-day developed nations as models. There are differences in the conditions at which today's nations will start developing and the conditions at the time the present-day rich nations started developing. These different initial condition concerns available physical and human resources, per capita incomes and GNP levels in relations to other countries, eliminate population size, rate of international trade, capabilities in science and technologies, stability and flexibility of political institutions. But still, developing nations can benefit from the history of economic growth of modern nations. The experience of modern nations shows the social cost and benefits of growth. An awareness of this cost and benefits would help developing nations plan their growth carefully. The most important social benefit of progress in increased freedom. Among its costs are undesirable living conditions and undesirable changes in ways of life and institution. That's it for today for this chapter. Good day and God bless everyone. Thank you very much.